Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our webinar today on Banter, Making or Breaking Barriers. My name is Glenn Hayes. I'm National Head of Employment Law at Irwin Mitchell, for those that don't know me. I'm really pleased today that we're joining forces today with an organisation called Focal Point. Focal Point are a consultancy specialising in helping organisations create inclusive and respectful working environments. So I'm joined today for a sort of fireside chat, if you like, without the fire, because it's absolutely sweltering hot, by Stella. So I'll let Stella introduce herself now.
Good morning, Glenn, and thank you very much. Yes, I'm the Director of Development for Focal Point. Yes, very relieved we're not going to be sitting by a fire. And yes, we're a management consultancy that really specialise in helping organisations shape workplace banter, shape workplace behaviour. And bearing in mind how many people have joined us today, I'm absolutely delighted that this is an area that people are so interested in. And actually, before we start, there is going to be some audience participation, including you, Glenn, as well. I'm going to ask everybody just to note what their immediate reaction is to that word. So when we say the word banter, what is your immediate reaction? We will come back to that a little bit later, including you, Glenn. I'm going to ask you as well what you thought. But to kick us off, Glenn, can I ask you what prompted your research in this area?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's been lots of buzzwords in the previous sort of 12 months, really, and the start of them really relate, and a lot of them come out of COVID. So the start of it really related to a phenomenon called quiet quitting, and that was not where people were quitting their jobs, but they were doing just enough to stay in employment, but weren't really going overboard to do a sort of really good job or go the extra mile. They were just doing just enough. Now, the flip side of that then became a phenomenon called quiet firing, and that was where sort of employers were gently easing or generally easing people out of their employment, not necessarily by sort of, huge shoves in the back or anything like that, but essentially, making it difficult for them, treating people poorly, perhaps ignoring people, leaving them out of opportunities, so sidelining them things, and sort of making the workplace a bit unpleasant in general until an employee feels that they've got no alternative but to leave. So following sort of that, we wanted to gain a better understanding of how employees feel they were being treated in the workplace, which sort of led to the survey into banter and bullying.
What were your key findings? I'm guessing they're here on the screen, but can you talk us through those?
Yeah, absolutely. So 32% of those surveyed have experienced bullying disguised as banter, which shows the extent of the issue in the UK workforce, really. But I'm not sure that's that surprising, to be honest. But what was interesting really was that there was a very disproportionate levels of sort of bullying in different types of industries. So, for example, 50% of those surveyed in the sports industry said they'd been experienced bullying disguised as banter, and 50% in the music and arts industry. So I sort of think around that a little bit, and I was thinking, well, why might that be the case? And I think, we're going to go into the issue of banter a bit more in more detail, obviously. But if you think about a sports team, there is a huge amount of good banter that goes on in those situations. So I've played in sports teams all my life. My best friends are probably from sports organisations and teams that I've played in, certainly the people I keep in contact with now. And, there is a high degree of banter that goes on, and a sort of reliance upon each other. You're in the trenches together type thing. But equally, it can go too far. So you see lots of professional sports players now, for example, who are now coming out, for example, as gay, whereas they didn't feel they could come out before. You see people who, it's not just about sexual orientation, it's all kinds of things like disability, it's, things like ageism will come into play. So you can see why in certain industries it might be more prevalent than others, really. So it's quite interesting. So that was sort of our research. Then, Stella, what prompted yours?
Well, before and I'm going to very much want to tell you about that, but can I just ask you, I just take you back to when I asked everybody just to think about what they meant. And it's interesting, you've just said about good banter, but you have commented it can go too far. But what was your own immediate reaction, and particularly I think when you started doing this research, to the word banter?
Yeah, so in my head, the sort of definition of banter really is words or actions, usually in groups, designed in a playful manner to be humorous in some way, often at the expense of an individual. Okay, so obviously it's the last part of that might get people into trouble where banter goes too far, but I'm sure you're going to expand on that further.
Lovely. Okay, thank you. And again, as everyone's listening here, I'd like you to sort of think about what your reaction was again as we go through this, and that really lines with mine. And you know, when we were just planning this webinar and talking about it, and I said to you, my first moment, I think my first times where I realised I was 17 and I joined the civilian side of the Metropolitan Police. And there was something, and I didn't really quite understand what it was exactly that was going on in terms of that. But there seemed to be this moment where it almost like this humour just really did affect people. And then if you showed any reaction, I very much, you know, it rings in my ears, that phrase, if you can't take the heat, get out of the kitchen. And I think it was experiences back then. And I think that's why one of my motivations nowadays, I think I look back then and I think I wish I'd had more knowledge, more confidence, I think, just to tackle some of that stuff. So hopefully I'm doing a bit towards that now. But that's really what has interested Focal Point. And if we could have a look at slide 3, this really is what we think about in terms of banter can be such a good thing. You know, it really can bring down the barriers and create a shared sense of fun, no doubt about that. But there really is that tipping point where that crosses the line. And again, we'll explore this a bit more in the webinar, but it's when people, and I think you've picked up on this, Glenn, when people start to feel uncomfortable and then those barriers that have come down go up and very often stay up. So our motivation, we've done 2 surveys now. The first one back in 2016, we really wanted to explore with what that impact was, and particularly, as I say, when that banter had crossed the line and was starting to make people feel uncomfortable. So that was our initial survey. And then the survey that we did across 21-22 picked up, and again, interesting what you just said about sport and that effect on people. What we really wanted to explore further then was, is there a link between the moment when banter has crossed that line and negatively affecting people's willingness to speak up about mental health? And that was particularly what we were doing, and that's sort of trying to explore, you know, was there a fear of being laughed at, not being taken seriously, perhaps being given a nickname, an example of banter, about not being able to cope. So those were our motivations for our research.
And Stella, it's really interesting that you picked up on your example that you gave involved the Metropolitan Police, because, you know, that's an organisation that's taken some fairly heavy stick, to put it mildly. You know, it's been described as institutionally racist recently. So it's quite interesting that you chose that as your example. But I'm really interested in what your comments on that and the sort of key findings that your research found, really.
Well, yes, I mean, in terms of the Metropolitan Police, I will admit, you know, sort of still being very proud. My father was a police officer, still very proud of that. I think it's important to remember there are just under 48,000 people currently in the Metropolitan Police. So sadly, it's inevitable that there will be some people that let the organisation down. But I think some of the things that are happening now, and again, I really support that key focus on leadership, because a lot of this is down in any situation just to how managers and leaders set that culture. And clearly there's certainly aspects of the Metropolitan Police that hasn't been happening, so it's really important we look at that. But yes, if we come back to our survey, and I don't know if we can actually move on now, the slides, whether they'll move on. If not, brilliant. Okay, this talks about some of the examples that we were getting, and I think, again, if you look at these examples here, it definitely very much gives that 2 sides to this story. You know, there can be that fun, that sense of team, but also a lot of people talked about when it had crossed the line. And actually some of the free text examples that we got were quite shocking. We didn't really think we could be shocked anymore, and I'm sorry to say we actually were, and some of them, particularly about personal characteristics as well, which again I'll come back to. But if we could have a look at slide 5, of our 21-22 survey that we did, we had 775 people responded to that. A lot of them in the financial sector, but a lot is for professional services and quite widely. And the figure that just continues to sort of swirl around in my head is that 97% of those 775 said that at some point they are negatively affected by banter. Now, some of them said most of the time, some of them said occasionally, but still, staggeringly, 97%. If I don't need a motivation to keep doing this work, but if I needed one, that would absolutely be that. Then, when we looked at these figures more, 40% of those who'd responded that actually said that the banter did affect how they felt about themselves. So, you know, bearing in mind our thoughts about, is there a link to people being willing to speak about mental health? And also of those, 22% of those did acknowledge that it would probably lead to them feeling uncomfortable and not raising that with their line managers. So that's about 1 in 5. And if we stop ourselves and think, you know, the teams that we are managing, perhaps 1 in 5 are left to feel uncomfortable. And Glenn, can I ask your permission to talk about a personal frustration now? You need to say yes, by the way.
You don't need my permission to ask about that.
No, and it really strangely, actually, by complete coincidence, I saw something about this yesterday, but I must admit, I do have a frustration about the various events that are billed, how to engage staff, and they'll talk a lot about motivating people and rewarding people and all of those things, but they don't pick up that a major fact about how we are engaged, of course, is how we feel day to day. And there's some staggering facts here on this slide. And again, if we think about, you know, what we try and think about getting the best out of our team, 60% of our respondents said they would put forward fewer ideas. 69% said that they knew that there were times where they had contributed less in meetings. And then when we talk about retention and your stuff, Glenn, about the quiet firing, 33% had said they'd looked for a new job. And just a couple of weeks ago, I was talking to somebody that said to me he was unlikely ever to want to put forward maybe a little bit of a sort of a different kind of creative idea at a meeting, because every time he'd done that recently, he'd been reminded, including by his own line manager, of an occasion where he put up the wrong presentation at a client review meeting. And he said it just goes on and on. So, you know, this kind of stuff, we just are not joining the dots sufficiently to really understand if it's not managed properly. And I know we'll come back to that because we want to retain the fun, but what impact it is having. So actually, Glenn, I'm really interested. How do you define what is banter when you're talking to your clients?
Yeah, so I think from my point of view, Jemima, do you want to move the slide on? So I think banter is a really good thing in an organisation if it's done well. You know, if it's genuinely fun, people work with people. You know, the part of the attraction of coming back into the office really is to ensure that you know, people have interaction with other individuals. It can be pretty soul destroying if you're sitting at your kitchen table, or in my case, a very flowery office, as people like to point out all the time.
I do like the wallpaper.
So it's, you know, I think it's important, but I think from a danger point of view, do you want to move the slide on? What the tribunal stats are is that UK employment tribunal cases are up by 45% related to banter type issues. So where banter tends to come into to sort of play in the tribunal arena are things like discrimination cases and other areas such as constructive dismissals. So essentially you might get what essentially are what might start off as reciprocal jokes or comments between colleagues, and ultimately there's a very fine line between bullying and banter, and it's very subjective. So what might be banter one day might be looked at bullying as the next. So for example, I recently dealt with an employment tribunal claim that started from an employee being awarded the Employee of the Month award. Now it sounds like a fantastic achievement, but the problem is that everybody started taking the mickey about him about being teacher's pet and all of this stuff. And it's a bit sort of children in the sort of play park type scenario, but all of that was sort of relatively okay. And then this individual was from a different country, and somebody then started taking the mickey out of his accent. And I think the problem with that type of case is that it becomes very difficult to defend from an employment tribunal point of view, because unlike direct discrimination, where somebody, for example, is doing something because of somebody's protected characteristics, or, I discriminate against you because you are disabled or because you're a woman, which is fairly, is not very prevalent these days, thankfully. The difficulty with harassment type cases, it's not just what the person's intention was who was doing the harassment, it's the effect that it had on the individual. So something that wasn't necessarily designed to hurt somebody can have that effect. So what you often find in harassment type examples really is defences that come out in employment tribunals to say, well, this person gave as good as they got, and the idea behind that type of defence, and it's a tricky one in fairness, is really to say, well, actually, not only was there no intention to harm that individual or place them in the offensive environment, to use the sort of wording of the Equality Act, or part of the Equality Act, it didn't have that effect either. And that becomes very difficult because, from an individual's point of view, how do we know what the effect is on them? Do they take it in good spirit at the time and then go home and, cry to the wife or the husband or whatever, or do they hit the bottle when they get home, or how do people deal with that type of thing? So the focus really should always be on the perception of the individual receiving the treatment, as that's what a tribunal would review if it ends up as a harassment claim, for example. So interestingly, one of the questions that we got through, Stella, beforehand was, was a question around banter that could be construed as sexual harassment. So, and any practical tips? So, I think we discussed, didn't we, you saying, for example, "Oh, I like your shirt," is very different to, "Oh, I like your shirt," and it would probably come out differently from you to me than if it was from me to you, because, for example, if I was leering at you, for example, then that has a very different connotation when I say the words "I like your shirt." You could perceive me to be staring at your chest, for example. It's that type of thing that can get people into trouble quite easily. But actually, if I say genuinely, or you say to me, "I like your shirt," that's, hopefully that's making you feel good. It's not a, disgusting or a sexual harassing comment. But it depends on the context, and context is everything, isn't it? So, I'm dealing with a case at the minute, for example, where it's an individual that's been that he claims is the subject of age discrimination. There's various opportunities that he's not being given in his new job, which he says are related to the fact that, the perception is he's only got a couple of years left. But there are sort of age-related jokes that go in there. I think he's been called ET, for example, because of his wrinkly skin. So, all those types of things. I've just started wearing glasses for reading. So, I was very conscious when I went to pick them, because I don't look great in glasses, to be honest. So I was a bit like, can you get me a pair that don't make me look ridiculous, or a geek? So it's my exact words to the individual behind the counter. So, in terms of practical tips for employers to deal with them, then, having a good culture is really important. But, having a system in place to deal with it where it goes wrong is massive in my view. So another one of the questions that we got asked before the seminar itself was, what sort of evidence will be useful when challenging a sort of respondent on its behaviours and stuff. So I think somebody's sister was going through an employment tribunal claim looking at harassment, and the defendant was just saying it was plain speaking in terms of banter. Well, the sort of evidence, if you were acting for the individual, will be more about the effect that those words or actions had on the individual. So, for example, did the individual go home and was very upset? Did they send text messages to people explaining how upset they were? Did they try and raise matters with the management to say, "I know you believe this is acceptable, but I don't, and can you curb it?" type thing. So, all of those types of pieces of evidence that show the effect on the individual, obviously, as well as the words said or actions done or actions not done, because quite often it can be, going back to the quiet firing point, it can be where people aren't included, that, for a specific reason that will fall into the harassment point. So, all of those types of things that come into play, definitely. So, Stella, with that in mind, and bearing in mind what Focal Point do as an organisation, What are your tips for identifying when banter has or is likely to go too far, and how to help sort of rein it in, really?
Well, thank you. And I just have to say, first of all, I think your glasses are very nice.
No, thank you.
I do, and that's a compliment. And I also would like to say as well, and I think this is over the 20 years that we've been working in this area, we can honestly say the vast majority of people do not intend to offend. And I think that's a really, really important point to hold on, because when we are running the sessions and getting people to think about this, there's often a moment people go, I had no idea this was a problem. So that's a key thing about just getting people to realise and be able to be comfortable about talking about it. What is that definition of banter? So for us as well, we're talking to Jemima about this before as well, you know, what's okay, what's not. I think it's better to look at it from a different point of view as well, to think about it. And the key word that we use, it's when people are feeling uncomfortable. And it really does help, as I say, for people to understand what banter is. It's often when, you know, we get people to think about it, it's the nicknames that have been given, it's the in-jokes, it's the link to personal characteristics or to past events, which at the time, the past events could have been funny, but an initially, you know, good laugh, decompress and all of that. But again, it's like the guy who talks about not wanting to put an idea forward because of that experience at the client meeting. It ends up having completely the opposite effect. Numerous times I've gone on a visit to a client site and been introduced to people with a reference to a previous incident or something that really has passed into folklore and it's constantly being referred to. But it is about getting the balance right, and nicknames are you know, a great example and really interesting. My 89-year-old father was given a nickname in 1954 when he joined the Metropolitan Police that he prefers to his birth name. And I've often thought, you know, if I went home and said, Dad, I really don't like you being called by your nickname, that's inappropriate, that's not right for him. He much prefers that. But I think he's in the minority. I think there's a huge amount of people that have been given nicknames that at the moment might have been okay, but actually have just worn really thin. And those are the kind of things we just say to people as well. Just stop and think. If people have got nicknames in your team, have you checked out and one-to-one? Because kind of thing, if you say it in front of others, people feel the need to go along with it. No, it's all fine. It's all fine. Do they really like that?
Have you got one, Stella?
Have I got one?
Have you got a nickname?
Well, yes, there is a group of friends that I'll be seeing next month, actually, on a sporting weekend. And no prizes, probably for guessing this one. Somebody, I'm sure, over the weekend will mention whether I want a Stella Artois. So there's lots of that going. I've often replied to people, yes, please, but you'll find they're reassuring and expensive, and they don't quite know what to do with that. But you know, some of the other tips that we give to people, because we want people, and again, I hope people pick that up from what we're talking about. It's crucial that we continue to have the fun in workplaces. We just don't want that line to be crossed. So, you know, great, you know, we had a lot of good feedback over those simple techniques, like just getting people in teams, just to sort of say, you know, something happened yesterday. Okay, we've had a laugh about it yesterday. You know, when we come in today to work, and if somebody does refer back to it, that was yesterday's joke, let's have a new one today. So some of those things, just simple, but, you know, can allow that balance, really. We've also, you know, and I know a number of teams have often done this after we've worked with them, have had a word that when that word is said, everybody sort of knows the rule is, if you like, they stop talking about whatever it is. So a word like pineapple or something like that. And I know a number of teams that we have done that with, they have thought of a word like that, and they've come back to us and said, that's great. It just means when we're out for a drink or in a situation, the humour's building, somebody says that, no questions are asked, and that kind of stops. Now, you know, sometimes as a line manager, we need to take responsibility and perhaps have a conversation about what exactly it was next day. Of course, that's a judgment call, but more times than not, just some of those simple techniques can help us manage the fun. So for me, the key thing is people understanding a bit more about why we do need to understand that line and the impact. And one of the questions came in, and I think again it's a really good one, where, you know, we don't want to be seen as the HR, you know, killjoys, or as, you know, the thought police or something like that. And I think that's why it's really important to help people understand why this is an issue, and some of the statistics that we've looked at already. but also be assured we're not looking to stop the fun, we're just making sure it's inclusive for everybody. And that's a kind of a joining the dot to those of us that think a lot, quite rightly, about how can we create an inclusive work environment. So in our research, we found, and I commented earlier, that 33% of our 775 respondents had been prompted to look for a new job because of the banter that was constantly coming that way, which of course fits in, Glenn, with your comments about quiet firing. So have clients picked up with you on that impact of the banter when they talk about the quiet firing in the cases that you're dealing with?
Yeah, so when we see tribunal claims or grievances that might lead to tribunal claims, a lot of the times the client will say to us, yeah, but that's just industrial language, that's what we use, on the shop floor. That's the sort of people that we employ. And I get that, but I think the ability to change or influence some of that is quite important in my view. So I think clients need to be wary of that, because they're in employment tribunals for a reason, and if they're taking steps to try and clamp down on some of this industrial language in advance, then they might not be there in the first place. I think what clients are really worried about at the minute are the proposed changes to the third party harassment laws that have been announced. And actually, Mitchell are running a separate session on that very shortly. So if people want details on that, they can link in with us afterwards and find out how to log on to that webinar. But that is potentially a massive change and brings into play sort of people who come into contact with the public, for example, bringing claims against organisations. So again, it's got the potential to be huge. But I think clients do discuss banter with us. Obviously, there is a big link to the Great Resignation and issues with recruitment. So, for example, the clients can ill afford to lose the best people. Okay, and actually can ill afford to lose any people at the minute, because it's quite difficult to recruit to replace them. So, trying to have an environment that keeps staff. Okay, and pay isn't the massive factor for everybody. If you look at the McKinsey lists and things like that, it falls down at sort of number 7 or number 5. Out of a sort of big long list of what drives people at work and stuff. And so all of these issues are, really do come into play. So creating that environment to keep people, retain them is massive in my view. It also comes into things about whether to employ or not employ. So, people of a childbearing age, you see these horrific things to say, am I going to take on the 30-year-old woman because they might get pregnant in the near future? That type of stuff. I mean, to me, it seems nonsense. But out of a team of 80-odd employment lawyers, about 92% of them or something are women in my team. So it just doesn't come into play at all. But I think where we tend to see it a lot now is that there's a significant rise in mental health issues. So people who are working from home, working in relative isolation, or people whose mental health has deteriorated either as a result of COVID or since COVID, coming into the office, it's sort of, on a sort of 1 day, 2 day a week, it sort of almost concentrates things. And what you don't want to have is a situation where all that sort of good banter is concentrated into sort of a day or 2 days, and somebody comes in and dreads coming into the office, for example. It's supposed to be a good thing. So we've had some fairly high profile employers under the cost criticism wise recently. So the CVI will be a good example. Met Police we've already mentioned. And that the impact that it can have on the team in general and the reputation in the sector is potentially massive. So one of the questions that we had in advance was about work. What's my view about workplace discussion about controversial topics like Black Lives Matter, or sort of returning immigrants arriving on small boats to their home countries. So I suppose the Gary Lineker stuff would be a good example of that, where staff might be offended by other people's opinion. Well, if you take Black Lives Matter first, a lot of people got offended by that phrase because it's sort of, Black Lives Matter, White Lives Matter, all lives matter. And I've got an example of an employer client that sort of raised the issue following the killing of George Floyd and tried to do a good thing with its staff by saying, we're concerned about this issue. You know, if anybody wants to share any discussion points on it, you know, please let us know through the sort of forums that they had, and they set up a forum to sort of promote black people within their organisation in terms of views, as opposed to, you know, promotion in terms of, you know, movement upwards. But, you know, on the face of it, that was a really good thing. But it, you know, what it prompted was some sort of dialogue between members of staff, and then it escalated into, in this case, full-scale grievances and a 10-day employment tribunal, which we had to go along and defend on behalf of the client. So, you know, these are fairly controversial topics, and they need to be managed very carefully. Otherwise, they have the potential to go off into different areas. And you know, in this case, an area of the employment tribunal where you wouldn't want to have gone. But the idea behind it was a good one, you know. But it does. The problem is it divides opinion, and I think one of the other questions we had was about gender fluidity, as well as sort of new neurodiversity issues. And to me, this is a massive hot topic. So people who are undergoing the whole topic about transsexuals and stuff is huge, because it seems to be that there doesn't appear to be much middle ground. It appears to be you have one view or another one, and it's very harsh on either side. And people are very active in sharing those views. You know, so some people are of the view that you can never change your assigned sex at birth, for example. There's, you know, clearly form a different view, and they are very highly funded as well. So, you know, there's crowdfunding facilities in employment tribunals that people have cottoned on to, and people like J.K. Rowling are involved in funding things like this, and, you know, just because they hold strong views themselves. So, you know, you can get involved in huge disputes if you're not careful. So I think that ability to discuss them sensibly is a good thing. You know, trying to do the right thing is clearly a good thing, but it does need to be carefully controlled. So, Stella, what impact have you noticed on teams as a result of Banter? Do you think it's generally a positive or a negative thing?
I'm going to say 50-50. You know, and when it's well managed, it's terrific, and I hope most of us would be able to recognise that and have enjoyed it. And I know we're focusing more on when it's crossed the line, so let's keep holding on to that thought, you know, the fun that it can cause. But when it's not managed, yes, then we do see people feeling uncomfortable. It's, you know, it's not easy to manage, but it's not impossible, and it is the responsibility of everyone. But again, particularly we sort of think about in terms of managers, in creating those opportunities so their teams can talk about what's okay, what's not. One of the techniques that we work a lot with a team is to create a team charter, 10 to 12 bullet points that they've created themselves that talk about how they're going to do that. And often it's a link to how they're going to respect one another. All these things, you know, do often come together. And again, you know, the key thing is, and you've touched on some very sensitive topics here, we want people to feel they can have those conversations. Often they will, you know, enjoy and learn from each other. We also don't want them, though, feeling that they're walking on eggshells. That's a, you know, a phrase that I think a lot of people then talk about, because they're not then sure, can they ask a question? What can they do? What they can't do? So again, the key thing, and that's very much the sort of the work that we do in Focal Point, is creating those environments where people can, in a safe environment, open up those conversations and really be able to talk about it. And also then what we talk to teams about is, you know, just saying, you know, if somebody has crossed that line, then let's be able to say that, hopefully explain why that's happened. And again, there are key stages here. That person then, you know, needs to learn from that, not repeat that. But if we can have some of those sort of, you know, strategies in place in a team, we can get that balance right between having those discussions, having some of that humour, but not crossing that line. I said, easier said than done, but it can be done. And one of the things I've always said as well, and I know, appreciate that's, you know, a bit subjective in one way, but if your management, I'll call it your management, but it's for anybody, but I've used the phrase as my management antennae flaps, I'm starting to think, I think this might have gone a bit too far. You know, people could be feeling uncomfortable. Be confident, do something. And I can honestly say, in all the years, I really mean this, in all the years where I have trusted my antenna, and I don't mind admitting, even my experience, my sort of pulse rate goes up a bit when I do it. But when I have stepped in and done something, I have never been told afterwards, oh, I don't know why you did that. Quite the opposite. And what's interesting as well, if I could admit to some sort of judgments here, perhaps I think in my head I'm thinking, oh, perhaps that person will be offended or that person will feel fine. I'm often wrong. So don't make judgments and assume that everybody thinks this is funny or not. If your antennae flaps, do something about it. And I think people will be, very grateful. An interesting point, I think, as well, and I think for those of us sitting here, perhaps, in our management role, I would ask you just to think about this. Is there a reason that stops you when that antennae flaps and you don't do anything about it? And again, we open up these discussions with managers and get the managers, and I understand this, I've been there myself, but often the reluctance to stop something is that moment of feeling part of the gang and not wanting to be seen as the killjoy. And
so then,
again,
Stella,
just stop and ask yourself that question.
So then, how do you do that then without coming across as a spoilsport?
Well, again, I think it's some of those comments I said earlier, a bit like that was yesterday's joke. I've actually just said to people, that's enough. I think the joke's gone too far. Let's move on. Done it with the right tone of voice, a smile on my face. But you have to take responsibility there, because otherwise, these things, often the cases that we are looking at, I know you're far more observed of that, but where perhaps, it's reached that point of quite a serious point of sexual harassment. When we've gone back, it's often started as a bit of humour that wasn't stopped at the right time. And that's the bit where we just need to think. And then, one joke is one thing, and then a little bit riskier, a little bit riskier, a little bit riskier. So that's the kind of thing that we need to be thinking about. So, Glenn, what do you advise your clients about in terms of that risk and impact of bullying and inappropriate behaviour?
I think the risk with bullying or inappropriate banter is that could lead to claims, like I've said, about harassment, discrimination, constructive dismissal. So not only against the individual, but against the business as well. So, and obviously the huge risk is the reputational damage to the business and the team, as well as a financial award. So harassment in Section 26 of the Equality Act is defined as unwanted conduct related to a relevant protected characteristic, which has either the purpose or effect of violating somebody's dignity, creating an intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating or offensive environment for the individual. So it's important to realise, like I said before, the individual harasser doesn't necessarily need to intend to harass. The test takes into account what the person on the receiving end feels, subject to that feeling being reasonable in the first place. So we deal with a huge amount of cases arising from harassment and discrimination. And the vast majority of these arise from actions that could have been prevented if the right training had been implemented beforehand.
Do you have any examples that you can give us of cases you've dealt with?
Yeah, so some fairly horrific ones, so some sort of designed to shock, if you like. So I recently acted for a woman in a sexual harassment claim. A male colleague suggested that they celebrate new business by ejaculating onto her chest. I mean, just the mind boggles, doesn't it? So, so obviously they suggested that was banter, but it's the sort of thing that can lead to a claim, understandably, and unfortunately happens more than you would think. We see a lot of cases where colleagues have been subjected to inappropriate comments about race, sex, sexual orientation, other protected characteristics. So quite often, making the comments the person doesn't appear to realise they're inappropriate in the first place, which is the main issue. So what we're trying to do is we spend a lot of time trying to educate and inform clients and their employees to avoid those situations to stop them from happening in the first place. What do you tend to see, and why do you get called in?
Well, just picking up what you said, actually, from going back, we were just absolutely horrified how many people think it's okay to make comments and give nicknames to people about their weight or things like that, their personal characteristics. So that was actually appalling. Well, agreeing absolutely entirely that if we can give the right training, I know I would say that coming from my background, but it's about giving the opportunities for people to discuss this. Having a policy is the key first point, but it really isn't enough. You have to create those opportunities for people to open up and have those discussions. And we love it. The perfect situation is when a client comes to us, there's no particular issues, but they would like to open up those conversations and get the culture right from the beginning. But if I'm honest, most of our work is triggered in an organisation when there has been a complaint or a disciplinary or a grievance, or one actually, not that long ago, just HR had just got that sense. A number of people were coming to them with issues, and that had been what had actually sort of triggered it off. So it is normally something, but at least then when we're coming in, there is that opportunity, as I say, to sort of draw the line, open up those conversations, and start to really explore and give people that opportunity to talk about that right kind of culture.
So in some extreme cases, sadly, I've even seen people take their own lives. So I dealt with a case a few years ago for an individual that had just left university and started her first job as a female engineer in a very male-dominated environment. And she was a practicing lesbian. So she had a partner, a workplace found out about it. She was subject to some fairly horrific comments and behaviour. And unfortunately, she took her own life. So I acted for her estate via her father. And we brought a claim against the employer. And we managed to settle it. I mean, these cases aren't worth very much in terms of financial value because there's no loss of earnings element to them because the individuals died. But it's not really the motivation factor behind bringing the claim in the first place. And what we actually did was we got things dedicated in a memory. So, we opened a wing of the university that she went to, for example, and named it after her. So, it wasn't a university that was discriminating against her or anything like that. It was a private employer. But it's just staggering, isn't it? Have you ever heard of any of those types of issues?
Well, I'm relieved. I've certainly heard it. I'm relieved to say that none of our clients have come to us, but that's not to say that people in their organisations haven't thought about them, and certainly they're repeating it yet again. But some of the free text examples that we were given in our last survey, I would not be in the least bit surprised. And again, more motivation, if you like, for us, because I think it's really important as well. If you've never been on the receiving end of any of this stuff, and I often think, when we're running our training sessions, we do make that comment and say that if you've never been on the receiving end, you probably think, what on earth are they going on about? However, and again, our style of work means we do open up and give people opportunities, and perhaps small groups as well, just to share with each other. It's then fascinating how many people actually, when they do get that opportunity, to be honest, actually have experienced it and know those feelings. So it doesn't take a lot to imagine. And I think if you're in a situation where you perhaps haven't got family, friends, colleagues that you can actually open up to and know you can be trusted to do that, I dread to think. And I think, listening recently to that shocking, listening to a radio programme and they were talking about Police Scotland and some of the people talking about that. And how many people have had suicidal thoughts. I'm not in the least bit surprised. We just don't appreciate when this banter crosses the line where it can lead to, and you only have to, I think, put into the mix some other stuff going on in different parts of our lives. For many people at the moment, it's a very, very difficult time. Just add in all this stuff and you can absolutely see just starts to push people into that very, very dark place.
So what's the best way to avoid inappropriate banter and bullying in the workplace to clients?
Well, that's again, I think it's, where we come in and we can open up, not saying it always has to be us, of course, but, managers recognising the importance of and I've probably used these words before, but I'll say it again, in creating that environment where people are able to have those discussions and actually say what is okay and what is not, and then really decoding. That's something we talk about a lot of phrase we use. You've got these words in policies which are quite right, but what does that actually mean? It's interesting as well that a number of policies would actually say that if you swear, gross misconduct and you'll be dismissed. Now in reality, most adult working environments, there will be some swearing. I know it's an emotive topic and we haven't got too much time, but one of the things we get people to talk about is there's a difference if you swear when your Wi-Fi goes down or your email doesn't go or something, to actually swearing at a colleague. And it just helps people. And I know, again, probably people sitting here thinking, well, that's quite obvious. But again, it's amazing how many people just really actually welcome that opportunity to have that clarity. Now, again, swearing can go too far. We just did a piece of work in a recruitment company a little while ago, and they were just talking that actually they realised that the swearing had become part and parcel of everyday behaviour, and how inappropriate it was. A client could hear it on the phone, but not just that, it was just wearing other people down. So of course there's that point, but it's just being able to get people to actually see, again, in most environments there will be, and a bit of an old-fashioned word, but teasing. There will be some teasing if you do something wrong. We don't want to make it completely sterile, but we want to allow people to really understand the kind of ways that we can get that balance right. Again, going back to some of the techniques I mentioned earlier in our discussion as well. So, those are the things that we're advising people to do. Again, the vast majority of people do not intend to offend, but actually when you open up this and do that, those people that perhaps are not willing to listen and think about this, actually it also means it gives an opportunity for managers to more clearly manage those people, and if needed, the disciplinary procedure will be needed if they're not willing to actually stop and think about their own behaviours. And just to sort of sum up that, what we are really saying to people, we ask people to think and take away from our sessions 2 responsibilities. A responsibility, and every one of us in Focal Point does this. I do this, most days. Just stop and think, is there anything that I shouldn't be doing? I should be thinking. Things change, views change. You mentioned a few that have changed recently. We need to be recognising that. So the responsibility to reflect on our own behaviour, but also, and this is really, really important, picks up on one of the questions as well that came in. We want people to actually accept the responsibility that if they are made to feel uncomfortable in any way, they'll do something about it. I'm going to stretch my arms out as well. I did that because that responsibility covers everything. It could be the fact you yourself just feel comfortable and able to speak one-to-one to the person that's made you feel uncomfortable. Great. But also for a whole range of reasons, totally acceptable, you may not feel comfortable to do that. That's fine. We understand that. We're not going to ask why. We're just going to ask that person to make sure that they go and talk to somebody that can do something about it. And again, where we've introduced those 2 responsibilities into organisations, that's worked very well, and people then feel actually there's something is going to be done if I raise this, because again, this is a major issue that organisations have got to get right as well. Part of people understanding what's okay, what's not, but also having everything in place that gives them the confidence that if they do raise an issue, something will be done about it. So that's what we're trying to get across to people in what we're talking about. Glenn, can I ask you another question?
Yep.
So if an employee says something inappropriate to a colleague at work, what do you advise your clients about in terms of who's liable for that?
Well, it's normally the employer that's liable, but there is a statutory defence to claims like harassment, which can help businesses avoid liability for the actions of their employees. So it effectively will hang the employee out to dry, for want of a better phrase, and place the liability onto them and move it away from the employer. But that requires that a business has taken all reasonable steps to prevent the harassment or discrimination occurring in the first place. So what do reasonable steps mean? Well, it means having policies in place like an equal opportunities policy, anti-harassment, anti-bullying policy. But it's more than that. So you've got to ensure that managers are kept up to date and regularly trained on them. You've got to deal with complaints about harassment in a serious but reasonable manner. So that might involve taking disciplinary action, for example. Is a need to ensure that employees are aware of the policies. So you can't just say, well, I trained them on induction and then that's fine. They've been here 10 years or whatever. And they've got to understand what they need to do in practice to comply with them. So that all helps. But it's quite a difficult hurdle to get over from an employment tribunal point of view. So to show that you've taken all reasonable steps, the tribunal aren't going to just look at the documentation and say, yeah, that's absolutely fine. They're going to look at what a business does in reality. So have they taken all reasonable steps? A recent case, for example, called Ali against Gellin, they found that employers can't rely on what they described as stale training to raise that defence. And in that case, the training was only 2 years prior. So, in my view, it's a difficult bar for employers to get over, and it's one they should be rightly worried about, particularly in light of the changes to third-party harassment. So it's really important that employers do keep their employees regularly apprised of this and take steps to deal with things seriously. What's your advice to organisations regarding banter in the light of the research then?
Well, I think it's really picking up what we said. I think it's absolutely critical we decode the word, because as we're been talking about with this, banter covers a lot of things. It's about holding those sessions, and what we really want to get across to the organisations that we work with, and I'm really proud that a number of them have done this. They can keep that momentum going. That team charter we talked about, one tip we said to clients, I was just doing this to somebody last week, is once you've got that team charter, again, it's likely to go onto your intranet or something like that, but link it to the induction and actually be very specific that when somebody new joins the team, their immediate line manager has a conversation with them and sets all of that out. So some of the things that perhaps will have come up in those initial discussions that form the team charter, they're kept alive, because it's very easy, and you're just saying about those 2 years, it's very easy if we're not careful just to let this slip. And we recommend to organisations, giving the line managers the confidence to do this, but again, understanding it is a responsibility. Have those conversations, raise that at a team meeting. A nice thing to do is say, open up the conversation and say, what examples have we seen of the team charter being demonstrated, and then maybe asking, have there been any where they haven't been? So make sure that those things are part and parcel of daily life, because all too often, I'm sure I know we've had that conversation about this ourselves, all too often all of this stuff, if we're not careful, that is then seen as something that we've done or something left over here and only referred to, unfortunately, when that line has been crossed and people are complaining about what's going on. So it's lots of those things. And I think, some really good points that came into us as we were preparing for this about, not feeling spoil sports and all of that. I hope, again, if people reflect on what we're talking about, we'll realise it's not about that. It's creating that environment where everybody feels uncomfortable. If I could go back to my frustration point, when we talk about engaging, yes, people do feel engaged and want to put those ideas forward because they know they're not going to be subjected to another comment about something that happened ages ago. So Glenn, based on the fact we've been chatting about this for quite some time now, what are your thoughts now on banter and where we are with it?
Well, I think my takeaway point is that banters can be both good and bad in the workplace. So I think it's vital that employers ensure employees know what's appropriate, what isn't, and it isn't through just taking them through the staff handbook. It's really about upskilling them and driving home what the policies state in practice. So more than ever, it's really important to ensure that employees fully understand and adhere to the training they've been provided with, given that a lot of it's now done from home and can sometimes be less interactive as a result. So given that lots of people are working from home, Stella, what do you think the impact of that is?
Well, I think it's really key, and I think, and the slide we got up here actually is started our thinking very much before we went into lockdown and all of those impacts. But actually, it's really important to think just how 21st century life, I think, has changed a lot, and I think we don't often appreciate, some of those impacts. We socialise more with colleagues, we have more relaxed dress codes, we share an awful lot of information about ourselves on social media. So it's not too surprising, I think, that those lines are blurred, and some of those things are positive. We don't feel we have to go in every day in a three-piece suit or a very smart dress and jacket or whatever traditional workplaces perhaps in the last century were wearing. But so it's a lot of positives, but we do need to recognise that there are also some points out. I've frequently now had meetings with people in their bedrooms, and I wasn't in their bedroom, I hasten to add. A virtual meeting.
Thanks for clarifying.
Yes, I just thought that might be quite important. It was all going very well until this point. But it doesn't take a great leap, does it, to imagine how you may make a comment about what you can see, the bed and all of that. So I think it's more important than ever that we are opening up those conversations and being very clear about that. Instant messaging service, again, can help communication hugely, but also we've got to be so good at that fired off comment, quickly done in the moment. Got to be very careful how that lands. It's probably not landed quite how we meant it to be. So I think there are a lot of things that we can think about. Again, a lot of positives, fantastic, the changes that people have been able to make, perhaps to their sort of working styles and patterns. But I think it's also brought issues that we need to make sure that we are airing and managing carefully.
So Stella, I saw a thing on social media the other day that said, dance like no no one is watching, write an email like it could be read out in an employment tribunal. So that sort of resonated with me a bit, really, because you do lots of this is obviously seen and oral and stuff, but you do see it in written form as well. And the rise of the WhatsApp group and all of that stuff, you know, how people can interpret things perhaps wrongly, for example, is massive, really. So
absolutely, and you know, it's, I think, just stopping there, it is, there's often a race to try and think you're going to be the first person to comment on something or be the funniest or something. And no, that's not a great way to be. I mean, it again can be appropriate in a moment, but I think there's a lot of people that have commented, I just wish I'd stopped and thought before I hit the send button.
So somebody's asked us on the chat if I could repeat the name of the case that I was talking about before. So it was about the stale training. The case was a case called Allay, A-L-L-A-Y, UK Limited versus Gehlen, G-E-H-L-E-N. So that's the case about the stale training. So Stella, let's move away from the negative stuff. Let's end on a positive then. How do we think we can get it right?
Well, as I say, I'm going to sound a little bit like a stuck record, but the key thing is to give those opportunities to people to understand what that is. Try and create that environment, as I say, and I think, you know, those two responsibilities, if we can get to that point, then we honestly, because, you know, those of us that work full-time, you know, that statistic about we will spend the majority of our waking hours at work with colleagues. So we want the fun, but again, as we've kept saying, we also need in every way to be conscious and aware that, you know, those things, there is a line that can be crossed, and, you know, we do need to respect that there's a difference between being with our work colleagues and being down the pub at 9 o'clock on a Friday night with our mates. That's a different thing. When we're with our work colleagues, we really have that responsibility to stop and think, what reflect on our behaviour and just really think, is it fun, or is this fun that's at somebody else's expense and that it's leaving them feeling uncomfortable? And that's not what we want to be. We want to have that lovely fun where everybody's included and is laughing about something. And I'll just give an example. And very recently, somebody's going out on a team event to an escape room in a couple of weeks' time, and just asked my advice about getting that balance right. And we talked it all through. And what they're going to say to their team is that on the day after they've had that escape room experience, they're going to go out for alcoholic and non-alcoholic drinks. We're talking about that. And that during that time, providing it's really, but there will be laughing and joking about what people have done. But they're going to say to everybody that ends there. The next day and going forward, when people come in, people they hope will say, "Oh, it was a great experience and we had lots of fun." But they're all going to sign up to the fact that they don't give individual examples of, "Oh, Glenn, God, you see what he did," kind of thing, that sort of thing. That will end that night. But they'll talk about the positives. And I think I was really pleased with the conversation I had with that person, because between us, we sort of had that discussion and got to that end point. And hopefully that's a good example of, yes, some laughing and joking about it on the day, some nice memories to go forward, but nobody feeling if something, they did do something silly or do something wrong, it's going to be constantly referred back to. So I'd like to think hopefully that's a good example to end my thoughts this morning.
Yeah, brilliant. So I'm just going to finish just by reminding people of the feedback form that's online. We're going to send out an email with it on as well, and you'll also get a copy of the slides and our contact details. But we have had one question that's going to come in, which I'm going to finish on, which is, what if the person who is being called out for banter says they act that way due to disability? Now, I think that's a really topical question, because I touched before on the issues about the rise in mental health issues, and we are starting to see issues arising where people say the comment that I made or the way in which I reacted was a consequence of the mental health condition that I have. So, ADHD or, conditions like that, or the behavior that was exhibited was as a result of a mental illness. And it becomes very difficult, because the starting point for most employers will be, well, I need to discipline this individual for whatever it is they did or said. But actually, you might be required as an employer to make an adjustment to that, a reasonable adjustment, depending on what that behavior was. So, the starting point might be to sit down with the employee and find out whether, what was said or done related to their disability, and if so, how. It might be to get some medical evidence to support that, or to rebut that, depending on what it is. You know, it might be that you need to take that into consideration when considering whether to apply a sanction to somebody. So, for example, you might say, well, okay, we accepted that was down to your medical condition, but actually it's still completely unacceptable and we can't have it because it exposes us to a tribunal claim or whatever it is. Okay, you know, you really upset that member of staff. So all of those things do need to be taken into consideration. And one of the things that I think is really important about all of this and about employment law generally is about dialogue. So if you speak to the individual and say, right, okay, we will now need to tell the staff about your condition, you know, what bits of it are you happy for us to share? You know, how are you happy for us to share it? Who are you happy for it to be shared to? You know, and, you know, in some circumstances, it might even be putting staff through training specifically in relation to that condition so they know how to interact best with that individual. So I'm seeing this quite a lot at the minute, and I think it's, you know, it's linked to sort of, you know, the ability to the world of work has changed, all of that stuff, but equally the rise in mental health is massive, and you need to think about it from both sides of the fence. You need to protect obviously your employees that are the subject of the harassment, but you might equally need to do something in relation to the alleged harasser and the sanction that you therefore apply and how you deal with that situation. Perhaps then what you would have done, because otherwise you might end up in an employment tribunal for how you know, for issuing a warning, for example, which will be a detriment to an individual, depending on what their condition is and how it affects them. So pretty much a minefield, and one that needs to be carefully navigated, but it's certainly something you do need to be aware of. So that's it from me and Stella. So thanks very much for listening. As I say, you'll get an email with our contact details after it. Stella, I'm going to finish now. I haven't told me your nickname to say I'm off for a pint of Stella. So with that crap joke in mind, hopefully
have a good one. Have a good one.
Have a great day. See you later.
Thanks, Glenn.